Hey everyone, welcome to the longest video project I have yet made on this channel. Now, this video is going to be separated into two parts, mostly because of length, but also because this is taking a lot of time to compile and a lot of time to present. This is the most information I've ever presented at one time. I am recording this all at once, but because of that, I am going to split it into two halves. You can find the second half of this video with a link on your screen right now. But today we are going to be talking and actually ranking on a tier list every British monarch since the Norman invasion of 1066. Now this tier list that we have here gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on top of 36 is 42 kings and queens. Now, we are going to shrink that down to 41 because this list also includes Lady Jane Grey. And when we get to her, I'm going to explain why I don't think she deserves to be ranked on this list, nor do I think that she is technically a queen or an actual monarch of England or of the United Kingdom. This is a long video, so if you're interested in learning more about British history or more about the British monarchs throughout their history since, like I said, the year 1066, then this video is for you. Feel free to put this on in your background or do whatever you like to learn more about this subject while we talk about it. The goal of this is to both compile a list, a tier list of monarchs that I feel have done great things for England and for the United Kingdom as a whole, and those who have struggled in their role, and over time, how the role of the monarch of England and the monarch of the United Kingdom has developed. Now, most of what I know about the kings and queens of England centers around two main sources. Now, the first one is going to be a book called The English and Their History, and the second is a video series that aired on UK TV in the year 2005 called The Kings and Queens of England, presented by Alan Ereira. Now, today we are going to start way back at the beginning and tell you how the English monarchy came to be. Now, before we get started with this video, make sure if this is something that interests you to like, share, and subscribe. It does wonders for the channel. Like I said, this is the longest presentation I have yet done, and hopefully if this video does well, then I'd like to eventually redo it with a little more editing and a little more style to my presentation here. But you are seeing my screen right now. We are going to start talking about the British Isles. This right here, these two islands and the surrounding little tiny ones around it are the geographical British Isles. Now, as much as Irish people, specifically in the Republic of Ireland, would not like to include themselves in the British Isles, Ireland as an island is geographically part of the British Isles. Now, this right section is Great Britain. This left section is Ireland. That you probably already know. Now, the interesting thing about English people, or the history of England and the United Kingdom, is that there isn't an indigenous people or an indigenous tribe or an indigenous race. The earliest people we know came over to the British Isles supposedly are the Picts. And we are going to talk about the Picts just briefly. Ancient and medieval tribe of people that predated history in the United Kingdom. Now, the Romans came over around the time of Christ. They had various interactions, supposed warfare, and then the Romans left as well, and they were essentially replaced by the Celts. Now, the Celts are an Indo-European ethnic group that eventually settled in what we know in our history as Western Europe, more specifically the western tips of France, and then over in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, which is where modern Celtic culture is still very much alive. Now, the Celts were the ruling people of the British Isles until the invasion of a people called the Anglo-Saxons. Now, most of what we know about English culture is rooted in the Anglo-Saxons. They are a cultural group that inhabited, I'm basically reading word for word as you see here, what is now England in the early Middle Ages. So they came to Britain from mainland Europe in the 5th century. That's the 400s after Christ. They are Germanic peoples. They came originally from what is now lowland Germany, in Saxony, and that area there. And they basically created the current English culture that we know until the year 1066. And they had multiple kings over time. If we look up Wessex, it is one of the 7 kingdoms that made up the heptarchy of England. There were 7 kingdoms in England, separated kind of like this, as you see on the right side of my screen here. Northumbria in the north, Mercia in what is now kind of the Midlands, Wessex over in the West Country, and the less so the extremes, but more so kind of just the short-term West Country. We also had Sussex, Kent, Essex in modern-day London and the estuary areas, and then East Anglia. And those 7 kingdoms made up what was called the heptarchy. If you're familiar, and we're actually going to be talking quite a bit with references to Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire in this series, because pop culture-wise, that is how most people can easily visualize English history. George R.R. Martin does a very good job at representing English history, specifically with his writings in A Song of Ice and Fire. So this is where the idea of the 7 kingdoms came from. It's these 7 kingdoms that ruled over England until about the 9th and 10th centuries. Now, eventually, all of these 7 kingdoms were combined into a single kingdom of England, and more specifically, Anglo-Saxon England. And that first king was a man called Athelstan. Now, Athelstan, according to what we believe his history to be, ruled from the year about 924 to 927. He was succeeded by his son, Edmund the First. His brother, Edmund the First, who was succeeded by Edred, who was succeeded by Edvig, who was succeeded by Edgar, who was succeeded by Edward the Martyr, who was succeeded by Ethelred the Unready, and a whole bunch of these Anglo-Saxon kings. Now, during this time, there was also an invasion of England by the Danes, the Danish Vikings from Denmark, from Norway, and they basically conquered the east of England. So if we look up a map of England here, Anglo-Saxon England really included all of the areas south right here, and all of the northern regions were ruled by the Danes, mostly in York. So York kind of served as the Danish capital, and there were a variety of capitals in the southern kingdoms. London obviously eventually became the primary capital. Eventually, Ethelred the Unready was succeeded by Svein Forkbeard, who was the first king of England, who was a Viking. He was the king of Denmark and the king of Norway. He ruled as the first Danish king of England for 5 weeks in 1013. And then you had kind of this massive civil war between the Anglo-Saxon cultures and the Danish people. Now, of course, there were fights with the Celts over in the far western extremes, over in Wales, up in Scotland. But for the most part, England itself was a battle between the two cultures of the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes. Now, Svein, a little side note here, he was the son of Harald Bluetooth, who is the king of Denmark and Norway that we get the name for Bluetooth from, which has really nothing to do with them, except that his name in Danish runes is what the Bluetooth symbol represents. So anyways, he was succeeded again by Ethelred the Unready, who retook over for about 2 years, 1014 to 1016. He was succeeded by Edmund Ironside, or Edmund II, who was succeeded by Canute, or Canute the Great, who was a Dane. He was succeeded by Harold I, or Harold Harefoot, who was succeeded by Harthacnut, or Canute III, another Dane. And now he was succeeded by Edward the Confessor, or Saint Edward. Now, Saint Edward is a huge, not even mythological, but a great figure in English history. He ruled for 63 years. He was one of the longest reigning, if not the longest reigning king of England prior to the Norman invasion. He didn't rule for 60 years. He lived 63 years, but he ruled from 1042 until his death, one of the longest reigning Anglo-Saxon kings. And this is where things get interesting, because when he died, he did not leave an heir to the English throne. Now, England is different from mainland Europe for a variety of reasons, not just geographical, but mostly cultural. Like I said, they don't have an indigenous people. England's history has been a variety of invasions by numbers of people. So when St. Edward did not leave an heir, there were a variety of claims to the throne because at that time, the King of England and how England in its history had come up is the king wasn't necessarily the son of the previous, or the new king didn't necessarily follow his father if his father was king. The king was basically voted in. It was usually a noble, usually some kind of relation to the actual reigning king. But all in all, the King of England was voted into office, kind of like a president, but I like to think of it more in the sense of, as an American, our history typically teaches us that after the American Revolution, George Washington, who had who had served as the primary general for the Revolutionary Army, was basically heralded as king. People wanted to vote him in as the new king. That is rooted in English history. That's where English history tells us these kings came from and where their power came. So, I mentioned earlier we're not considering Lady Jane Grey a queen. We'll come to her eventually, but that was one of the reasons that retrospectively they don't consider her a queen, because she ascended to the throne, but she wasn't acclaimed by the people. So anyways, we're sitting here in January of 1066. Edward the Confessor dies. He doesn't leave a clear heir. Now, one man claims the throne. He's an Englishman with Danish roots. Like it says here, Harold Godwinson was a member of a prominent Anglo-Saxon family with ties to Canute the Great. He claimed the throne. He claimed that Edward had given him his word that he would be King of England. So the people agreed with this and voted Harold to be the king. He became Harold II, the last English king of England. Now, two people were really peeved that Harold crowned himself king. One of them was Harald Hardrada, who was the king of Norway at the time, who claimed it by right of the Danish. He had become the ruler of the Danish invading army. And the other one was a man over in France called William I, or who would become William the Conqueror. Now, when Harold Godwinson became king, both of these men, William the Conqueror and Harald Hardrada, decided they were going to invade England. Now, they didn't tell each other they were going to invade England, but somewhat happenstance, they invaded at roughly the exact same time. In the fall of 1066, Harald Hardrada lands in the northern coast near York. William the Conqueror arrives near Dover, or more specifically on that coast. Eventually, they met at the Battle of Hastings. Harald Hardrada lands first. And obviously, Harold Godwinson is going to go up and defend his land from Harald Hardrada. He beats Harald Hardrada, and the Norwegian army, or navy rather, barely makes it back to Norway. At the same time, William the Conqueror lands on the southern coast. Now, these two men meet at the Battle of Hastings, which is told in this tapestry here, the Bayeux Tapestry, and William the Conqueror wins the battle. It's not clear who eventually killed Harold Godwinson, but history tells us, as history usually does, that it was William the Conqueror himself. So we start with the very first king of England, and I'm using air quotations. You can't see me on screen right now. My camera's off. But William the Conqueror becomes what history kind of agrees as the first actual king of a new England. 1066 is the year that England becomes what it is. Because for the first time, and something that has continued to this day, England's king or England's queen was not an Englishman or an Englishwoman. William the Conqueror came over from Normandy. Now, Normandy is an area in France, in the northwestern coast, not quite the closest area to England if you think of something like Dunkirk or across from Dover, but straight south of England, there is this territory called Normandy. And at the time, we should talk about why it's called Normandy first. Normandy, or the Normans, literally means the Northmen. So Normandy was a colony of the Vikings from Denmark and from Norway who had come to France on a series of their invasions. And when France became kind of its modern kingdom, the Frankish kingdoms, the kings of France gave Normandy to the Vikings, said, okay, we're not going to fight you, but we're asking you not to invade the rest of France. So you can have Normandy as long as we keep the rest of France. And over time, then when the French became more powerful and the Normans became less powerful, then Normandy itself became a vassal state of the French kingdom. So Normandy was just a duchy. There was a Duke of Normandy, and he was underneath the hand of the King of France. But he still had a significant amount of power. Now, the Duke of Normandy at the time of the invasion was William the Conqueror. So he came over to England, and when he won the battle at Hastings, became the King of England. He had a number of sons, one of which would go on to become Duke of Normandy, and then one of them would become King of England, and then another one would become King of England. Now, we're going to start ranking the kings here. William the Conqueror is a unique character in English history because obviously in our ranking, he is the first king. When he came over, he basically rewrote the entire system. The people tried to vote him in as king, but William, coming from Normandy and having a completely different culture, didn't understand what this was. And when they had voted him in as king and basically cheered him as their king and created this great parade for him, he thought that it was an uprising, ended up burning London to the ground, ended up going up to York, burning York to the ground, basically destroyed every city in England and rebuilt it as a Norman image. So we talk about the Anglo-Saxons being the root of English culture. William came around, destroyed England, and rebuilt it as a Norman civilization. So the Anglo-Saxon people were still there, their culture was still there, but the architecture, the ownership, the rule of England was now firmly in the hands of the Normans. They didn't speak they didn't speak English, they spoke Norman, which is a slight variation of French. It's very close to Old French, very different from modern French, but it's still somewhat tangible between the words. He didn't understand English. He had no idea what the system of government was like, but he came over and destroyed everything and then rebuilt it in his own image. Now, controversial figure, obviously, because you talk about conquests, you talk about basically the colonization of England by the Normans. Now, keep in mind, at this time, colonization of England was not only a historical thing that had been happening through England's entire history, but was actively happening with the Danes at the time as well. I'm going to put William the Conqueror, if I can find his number here, William the First, in A tier. Now, obviously a lot of bad things he did, but that was kind of the nature of the time. And you have to keep in mind that as we go through this list, we're basically covering 1,000 years of English history. Times were very different then than they are now. And so when I consider William the First an A-tier king, what I mean is he basically established what it meant to be a king. He recreated England in the way that, not quite the way we know it now, obviously, but a lot of what we know now about England is rooted in not only his invasion, but what he set up as Duke of Normandy and the first Norman King of England. Why I don't have him S tier, though, is there was not quite a lot to his reign. He obviously became King of England, but as soon as he had established his reign there, he went back to Normandy, and Normandy was his main focus. England basically became a vassal state to the Duke of Normandy, the same way that the Duke of Normandy was a vassal to the King of France. So France ruled over Normandy, and Normandy ruled over England. England was a secondary, if not a tertiary country in this new European society. Now, eventually he died in battle in France in 1087. Now, you would assume, based on the French way of doing things and the way that we know things now, where the son, the eldest son, gets the kingship, then his oldest son would become King of England. This wasn't the case. Now, keep in mind what I just said about Normandy owning England. When William I died, he gave the Duchy of Normandy to his eldest son, Robert, because that was his most valuable property. England, especially after he burned England to the ground, was essentially worthless in comparison to other territories on mainland Europe. So he gave Robert the first prize in his will, which was Normandy. He gave his second living son, William, the Kingdom of England. and he gave his third son, Henry, nothing, which became a problem. So that's where we sit with William the Conqueror. He dies in 1087. He gives William II the Kingdom of England, and the English people can't really say no. They don't agree with the fact that his second son is becoming king, but they also don't disagree with it because they had a completely different system of government, so they're not quite sure what to do, but they award him a kingship. William II, who is also known as William Rufus because of his red hair, Rufus being, like it says right there, the Latin for red, becomes king. And as soon as he moves to England, there's a serious problem. Because France at the time was a Christian kingdom, but Christianity at the time, or the large Catholic Church, had started growing more liberal with their belief systems. And when he came over to Anglo-Saxon England, their conservative views on lifestyles really came into effect in view of William. Essentially, he was gay. Has led some historians to speculate on homosexuality or bisexuality. The people didn't really care for him, and he did not get a lot done. He was king for nearly 13 years, and nothing really happened in his reign. Most of this is because history was rewritten by his successor. But there were a variety of conflicts going on during his reign, mostly disagreements with his elder brother, Richard, about who was in ownership of England. So William I had given William II England and given Richard Normandy, but historically Normandy had been the ruler of England, and William II didn't want to be ruled by his elder brother. This caused kind of a civil war within their family. There were wars between England and Normandy. And who became William II's second in command during these battles? It was his younger brother, Henry, who had gained nothing in his father's will. Now, 13 years and nothing happens but war. And suddenly, in August of 1100, he is out hunting with a party, including his younger brother, William, and he's hit by an arrow. Nobody knows who shot it, nobody knows where it came from, but all of a sudden, the king is dead. He didn't have any kings because he was he was gay. He didn't have children, he wasn't married. So where does the crown go now? Now, the Anglo-Saxons aren't going to vote for one of their own people to be king, otherwise the Normans will destroy them again. They've already been burnt to the ground before. So, the next person who's left is William's brother and William I's youngest son, Henry. Now, they call him Henry Beauclerc, which in English slang basically translates to Henry the Swat. As an American, I didn't quite understand what that meant the first time I'd heard it. Essentially, Henry was kind of a know-it-all. And the people at first didn't really like him that much. He was the fourth son of William the Conqueror, the youngest of his children, and spoke way too many languages for his own good, knew way too much about the people for his own good. But before we talk about Henry I, I have to rank William II. I'm going to put William II in F tier. Now, like I said, 13 years as king, nothing really happened, and a lot of this is attributed to history. But most of his reign had to do with war, and we don't know anything that really happened during his reign, and in comparison to his brother who succeeded him, got a lot less done and had a significantly lower impact on the history of England than his brother. So we talk about Henry I. Henry I takes over in the year 1100. And the first thing we should talk about with Henry I is that he completely completed his father's reform. When William I had come over and invaded England, he burnt it to the ground and rebuilt it in the Norman image. Now, what he didn't quite complete in that reign is he left all of the Anglo-Saxon barons and all of the feudal lords in charge. Henry was a smart guy. He realized that if he didn't replace the people who his father had failed to destroy, then he didn't really have a power base over the individual people. He would have to reign from the top and wouldn't be able to reign top down. So what he did was kill or have executed every single Anglo-Saxon baron in England and replaced them with people from France, but not just people from France who didn't have a penny to their name. Basically, people on the make, people on the rise, power-hungry people who knew that if Henry were to give them power, then they would be loyal to Henry for the rest of their lives. They didn't have any backing on their own, but as soon as they got power, they would be loyal to Henry and support him with everything they had. So that's one way that Henry changed and fulfilled what his father had started in 1066. Now, the second one is he combined the cultures. He started to realize that his father had completely destroyed the Anglo-Saxons except for their culture and tried to replace them with Norman culture. And he realized this wasn't going to work. So he replaced all of the barons with Normans, but then he started forcing them or sternly asking them to start marrying and reproducing with Anglo-Saxon women. Now, what this did was create new bloodlines, a new ethnicity, and basically tied the two cultures together in a way that could no longer be distinct. And essentially, rooting their own children in England with English blood would keep the Normans there in power, in genetic control of England for the foreseeable future or throughout the long future. Now, after this had happened, he reformed all of the laws and the political order. He started a completely new tax system. He started this system called the exchequer, which is a current system that most countries still have. If you think about modern taxes and the way that censuses work and the way that bank systems work, a lot of that can be rooted to what Henry I started in England. He created an entire task force to go around the entire country of England and count people's wealth and keep track of not only numbers in families, numbers in feudal lord systems, numbers in certain areas of the country. He accounted for his entire country. This was the first time it had been done in Western Europe in ages. And so he created this new system of accounting for the country and keeping the country informed to himself that had never been seen before in England, and reworked it to a system that is still partially in context today, or rather in practice today is the word I was looking for there. Now, Henry's death is an interesting one. So there was still warfare going on during Henry's years. But for the most part, he kept England safe, not only from the French, where they had had wars with his elder brother Robert. He forced Robert, in defeating them in battle, to proclaim him as an independent king of England. For the first time since the Danes started invading England, England was now completely independent of mainland Europe. Henry was the first independent king of England in hundreds of years. And in order to celebrate this, they were over in France. He and a whole variety of people in his party. He had two children, Empress Matilda, or his daughter Matilda, who he married off to the Holy Roman Emperor. So he created a huge political ally for England for the first time in the Holy Roman Emperor. This was massive. This was massively politically advantageous to the English in protecting them from all other invaders who might come and attack when they're weak. And his heir was his eldest son, named William Adelin. So after he had forced his brother Robert to maintain him as an independent king of England, he was over in France celebrating. More specifically, William Adelin was over in France celebrating. And as soon as they were starting to party and go on their way back across the English Channel to England, they had a little too much to drink. And as soon as they were leaving the harbor, whoever was guiding the ship accidentally crashed it into a massive rock, the Rock of Barfleur. And every single person on the boat drowned or was killed, and there were no survivors. And Henry, who for the first time had created the system of successors in England. He had proclaimed his son, William Adelin, to be his official heir, and all of the nobles in France and Normandy gave William Adelin that right. But now William Adelin was dead. Now, during this incident, there was supposed to be another person on that ship. The ship is called the White Ship. The disaster is called the White Ship disaster. It was really the first major royal tragedy to the English royal family. One person who was absent from the ship at the last second was a man called Stephen. He was a nephew of Henry. And Stephen basically got sick right before they were about to cross the ocean and said he was going to wait until he wasn't sick and grab a later ship, probably the next day. So everybody drowns except Stephen. Now Henry has no idea what to do here. He eventually remarries, but they don't have any sons that survive. And so he doesn't have an heir anymore. And he says, I want to be the greatest king in English history. I have to secure the future of this country. And if I don't, then all of the people are going to hate me for the rest of eternity. And he had nightmares about this for the rest of his life, but he basically makes the barons swear fealty to his daughter Matilda, the same way they had done to his son William. Now, I mentioned George R.R. Martin earlier. If you're familiar with the show House of the Dragon on HBO, which, as of me recording this video, concluded its first season and is currently filming and in production of its second season, Matilda is analogous to Princess Rhaenyra. So keep in mind that in that show, the king at the time is Viserys Targaryen. He is analogous to Henry I in certain ways, not the same, very similar circumstances, very different people. But in the show, after Viserys' son dies and his wife dies and he's left without an immediate heir, he makes all of the lords in Westeros swear their fealty to Rhaenyra. This was the exact same case with Henry and Matilda. Now, the issue here is England, even in its in the days of the Seven Kingdoms, they had never had a queen, a ruling queen in her own right. So the barons swore fealty to Matilda, but a lot of them weren't really prepared to follow through, or they had a lot of issues with it. So in 1135, Henry dies. What happens next? Now, first of all, let's rank Henry. I'm going to put Henry in S tier. And the reason I put Henry in S tier is where William I started the modern English state and what we know about modern English royalty, Henry I completed that vision. The people, by the time of his death, liked him. He had gotten society back on track. I think he, of all of the Norman kings, is the most powerful and the most well-respected historically. Now, not everybody knows his name, but I think he did so much for the English state that he deserves to be in S tier. Now, I also might be biased because, genetically, I am related to Henry I. I am actually a direct descendant of his daughter. Where is she at here? This Matilda, the Abbess of Montvilliers. So I'm kind of biased because he's my great, however many grandfathers. Now, I have a lot of those great grandfathers, but the fact that he's the only royal one makes me a little biased. But like I said, I think he did so much for the future of England and setting up the modern English state that he deserves to be S tier. Let me know what you think of that ranking in the comments below if you're familiar with English history and his story in specifics. Now, he dies. All of the barons had swore their fealty to Empress Matilda, but there was one person who didn't die on the White Ship, and his name was Stephen of Blois, which is a really fun word to say. He was the nephew of Henry I, the cousin of William Adelin, and he basically came over to England and said, you guys don't want a queen. Like, you don't want a queen. Like, you said you wanted a queen, but you really, like, there's never been a queen before. You don't want a queen. And all the barons were like, oh, yeah, you're probably right. we don't really want a queen. There's a lot of issues with how she's able to rule, given like the expectations in society for women and the idea of who's going to succeed her. And there are a lot of complications with the line of succession with women in power, and that's a whole nother video topic. But Stephen comes along and convinces most, if not all, of the barons to swear fealty to him instead and crown himself King of England. And Matilda is pissed. So Stephen kind of is analogous to the House of the Dragons character of Aegon II. Very different characters, very different people, but similar in positions as you see in that show. Now, this sparks what is called the Anarchy, and this is essentially the very first civil war of England, the first civil war after the Norman conquest. It lasted for about 15 years, and during this time, the forces loyal to Stephen of Blois and the forces loyal to Matilda, which includes, by the way, the Holy Roman Empire, because she's married into it. And this causes a massive, massive civil war. A lot of things happen during this civil war, one of which, Stephen basically destroys society. Everything that Henry I had built up and created this prosperous state, Stephen destroys in his reign for power. Over time, people started to realize that we actually kind of do like the concept of having Matilda as a queen. You know, she has roots in England. Stephen is very much a Frenchman. We don't really agree with all this war stuff, and we know that if Matilda was in charge, she wouldn't want war the way Stephen does, because Stephen is just trying to conquer. We've already had enough conquering in the last 100 years. We just want peace. So eventually, they force Stephen off the throne, and Matilda comes into power. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because Matilda had a coronation. But the people rescinded their adoration for the queen. Because Matilda, though she was born in England and grew up until she was aged 12 in England, she had married off to the Holy Roman Emperor and spent most of her adolescence and her formative years in Germany. Now, I mentioned English history and the English culture and the English people are very different than mainland Europe. One thing you'll note is the English have the stereotype of being very polite, being very kind to one another. Germans are known for being hardworking, being very to the point, and this didn't really bode over well because Matilda had learned how to be a German queen. And as soon as she comes over to England, she starts to rule like a German queen. She has no idea about the laws of England and upholding the culture of the people. She does not understand limitations on her power in favor of the people. She doesn't understand the feudal system. She just wants to rule and have everything done for her. And as soon as the people realize what they've done, they say, we no longer want this woman as queen. So, on our list, I'm not considering her a queen because, like I said, her adoration was rescinded. Her ascension was rescinded by the people. They bring back Stephen, essentially out of prison, and put him back on the throne. And they force Matilda over to France. Now, Matilda has a son named Henry. And we'll talk about Henry real quick. But Stephen continues his war. The culture is destroyed. He's still supported by the people because they gave him kingship, essentially, and they realized they didn't want Matilda. But as soon as they force Matilda out, then her son Henry takes over what is essentially her army. And then it's Stephen and Henry fighting after each other. And finally, after all this time with the Anarchy, Stephen realizes that he's tired of fighting. And in the year 1153, in November of 1153, Stephen and Henry basically strike up an agreement saying, all right, here's the deal. We're tired of war. Let's end this thing. So they go back to England. They announce to the people that Henry, Matilda's son, is now the heir to the throne. Stephen will remain king as long as he's alive, but Henry is going to take over the ruling of the country immediately. He's not going to do any of the mistakes his mom did. He's the king as soon as Stephen dies, which Stephen did within the next year. So Stephen, where are we going to put him on this tier list? I have Stephen firmly in my D tier. Now, I'm not going to put him F tier because the people liked him by the time of his death. They were sick of him about halfway through the Anarchy, but they realized that he wasn't the worst of the two options. They tried both. But most of what he did was destructive to England and destructive to society and destructive to the culture. I'm going to put him firmly in D tier. Now we move on to Henry II. And Henry II, like I said, was the son of Matilda, and his father was Geoffrey, the Count of Anjou. So his mother remarried after the death of the Holy Roman Emperor to an Angevin. So Anjou, the Duchy of Anjou, is in France, just south of what you would consider Normandy. So most of the people are still Norman, but a little more French. They have a little more French influence, both historically, ethnically, that sort of thing, but very firmly in French control. So now, not only are the kings Norman, but they are also rooted in the county of Anjou. And you might know them as the Angevin kings, but Henry II also starts the dynasty called the Plantagenets. Now, the reason for this is if you look at the crest of the Count of Anjou, let me see if I can find it. So, Count of Anjou. I don't know if it's going to show us a picture here, but the reason they called them the Plantagenets eventually instead of the Angevins, it was essentially a nickname because Plantagenista is a plant, or essentially a sprig of a plant that I can't remember which Count of Anjou wore as kind of his signature look. He basically put a flower in his cap and said, "This is my new look now, deal with it." And instead of calling him the Count of Anjou, they called him the Plantagenet. That's where the name comes from. Essentially, they're the same thing. One is just a nickname. Henry II comes, and what does he do? I got to find him on my list here. Henry II basically comes over, and there are a couple problems because he is in love with Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, Eleanor of Aquitaine used to be married to the King of France. If we look into her history, she was initially married to Louis VII of France. They kind of hated each other. They had the marriage annulled in 1152. And during the last few years of their marriage, she is cheating on him with ... Geoffrey of Anjou, who is a feudal lord of the king. So the king is basically getting... I shouldn't use that word on my channel here, but his wife is cheating on him with one of his inferiors, or one of the people underneath him. The king eventually dies, but Eleanor decides that after she is done being the mistress, essentially being the mistress of the Count of Anjou, she's going to start hooking up with the Count of Anjou's son, Henry II. So Henry II basically falls in love with a woman who was not only the Queen of France, now annulled or divorced, or however you want to look at it, but who also used to sleep with his dad, which is interesting. And his dad warns him about it. He says, "This woman is no good. You don't want anything to do with her. Don't give her any power. It is going to backfire." And Henry says, "Nah, screw it. Like, we're in good shape. Like, I completed the war of my mom. Like, I'm in good shape. We're fine. England's safe, blah, blah, blah." It was a mistake. So his wife comes over and essentially starts giving power to all of her relatives and speaking in Henry's ear, and he kind of operates as a zombie of his wife. He is so enamored with his wife that he basically does everything she wants. Now, at the time, there was a huge problem with the English church. Now, the English church was in charge of all of the laws in England, more specifically, the laws of the proper folk, the laws of the educated people. If a person in England could speak Latin, then common English law did not apply to them as the law that they had to reign under. As soon as someone was found to be able to speak Latin, or that they knew how to read or speak certain words, the church became in charge of the law. Henry didn't like this very much. Henry thought that this was a limitation on his power that he didn't like. Now, he understood that there were limitations to his power. His mom had found out the hard way that you can't always reign the way that you want to in England. The English people like to limit the king, and previous kings were okay with that. They understood that in order to have peace in England, they were going to have to appease the people in a certain way in order to be king. Henry understood that to a certain extent, but one thing he didn't like was the church having power over the laws over him. So, one thing he does is he looks to what his wife had been doing with the areas of society that she wanted changed, and she had been instituting her own family or her own friends into positions of power. And Henry II decides he wants to change the church. So, he installs his best friend, Thomas Becket, as the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is essentially the head position in the Church of England. And almost immediately, this backfires, because as soon as he gives Becket power over the church, Becket doesn't change the church for his favor. Becket takes control of all of the issues Henry had with the church. Now the church is not only more powerful than before because it has the word of the king on its side, Henry can't change his mind because he already put one of his own friends in position of power, and Becket is not budging on giving Henry laws over the church. And this goes on for a while, and finally, Henry II gives what is probably his most famous quote and says, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" He is so sick of Thomas Becket that he is essentially begging to his people, will someone please kill this guy for me? Like, I made a mistake. Just kill him. Like, I can't take him out of this position. I'm going to look like an idiot. Please destroy this person. And so they do. In the church, in Canterbury, I think it was in Canterbury. Let's double check here. Yes, in the cathedral itself, they basically slice off the top of Becket's head, which is kind of metal. But as soon as Thomas is killed, Henry has all of the people who had anything to do with the assassination basically disappear, if not be killed. And he claims that it was a surprise and that he had nothing to do with it. And, oh, Thomas Becket was my best friend. And even though I've kind of been, annoyed by him publicly over the last however many years or however many months, I had nothing to do with that. It's a big tragedy. We're going to proclaim Thomas Becket a saint, and I am going to basically give the rest of my life to the church. So Henry repents. He basically does all these things to make it up to the church. But in assassinating Becket, Henry, under the table, kind of gives himself more power over the church. The church becomes very paranoid that the king is going to have everyone in there assassinated. But on top of that, one thing that his reign is known for is the population became very much more educated. As soon as he started to get that control over the church that he wanted, now he wasn't afraid of people being educated and being under the control of church law rather than his law. And so for the first time, we see poor people being educated, learning how to read, that sort of thing. All that kind of medieval stereotype of the peasants not knowing anything, that started to be diminished under Henry II's reign. So a lot of ups and downs to Henry's reign. I'm going to put him firmly in the bottom of C tier. Where are we at here? Henry II, bottom of C tier. Then we move to his son, Richard. Now keep in mind, Henry was a controversial figure. He had very bad relationships with his family, mostly over his marriage. And when he started making really stupid decisions, like putting his friends in charge of positions that they could hold over him, his sons started to realize that their dad's kind of an idiot. And most of his sons rebel, and this starts another civil war between England and Normandy. Now, one of his sons who starts a massive rebellion is Richard. And as soon as he gets a lot of power behind himself, his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, basically abandons her husband for Richard I. Now, Richard I, you probably have heard of if you're familiar with Robin Hood. He is kind of the saintly king. His brother takes over power as King John, and Richard is over fighting in the Crusades, and as soon as he comes back, he's going to kick his brother off the throne, and all is going to be good in England. History has been very kind to Richard I. In reality, Richard I had a very, very bad reign. Now, he only ruled for 10 years. And 9.5 of those years, he spent outside of England. He was very much attracted to this idea that he was a medieval storybook king. So he went off on crusade because it was noble and historic, and he had this great idea of what the world was supposed to be, but he didn't really understand anything about politics, anything about how people work and how power really works. But he was fascinated with himself and his own stories. And so most of his reign, he spent in the Third Crusade. Which is fine if you're a defender of the Crusades and not fine if you're not a defender of the Crusades. Richard was as much of an idiot as his father was. So Richard's death is one thing to point out here. He basically had this idea that as soon as he was done with crusading, he was going to do this massive tour across Europe, back to England, and nobody was going to know who he was. He was going to walk through towns in disguise and pretend to live this very storybook life. And not a lot of people were having it. And as soon as he was in, I think he was in Austria. It says he died in Aquitaine. Let me find it here. Life after the Third Crusade. I don't want to quote this wrong because I don't want to be wrong about my understanding of what happened. But essentially, he was walking through Europe, like I said, under the radar, not quite as disguised as well as he would like to have been, insulting all of the kings that he had met along the way. And a lot of them said, okay, this guy can't slander us. We want him dead. Eventually, he was shot and died of blood poisoning. And then in kind of this storybook moment, he found the man who had shot the bolt and forgave him. And all of his men forgave him. And then as soon as Richard actually died, they recaptured the boy and killed him. That's about Richard's life in the Crusades. Now, Richard's life as a king was completely different. Because like I said, he spent 9.5 of his 10 years as king away from England. He only spent 6 months of his life in England. So history is kind to Richard because he didn't spend a lot of time in England, and he kind of became this figure that people wanted back because life in England was so bad. You had all of the idiotic mistakes of his father. Now, like I said, the people were getting better educated. They were starting to realize kind of their own person and their own influence on society as a whole rather than just following what their lords told them to do. But this is where you get stories of Robin Hood. This is where you get stories of looters and highwaymen. And it wasn't the anarchy, but there was anarchy in England because Richard basically abandoned his kingdom to fend for itself and have no leader while he was away. And so someone had to step in and fix this. And the person who stepped in and tried to fix it was his brother John. Now, everybody remembers John as a poor king, but England was not in a good place, and John didn't have the power to reign over Richard's kingdom the way that he should have been if he himself were actually the king. So Richard I am going to put Richard I, I'm going to put him below Stephen in D tier. Just because there was a lot going on in England before he left, and he decided he wanted nothing to do with it. He wanted everything to be joy and chipper, and he didn't want to deal with the consequences of politics. Now, back to George R.R. Martin and House of the Dragon. This is similar to Viserys, the king in House of the Dragon, where there's a lot of things going on, and he doesn't want to stop them because he doesn't want to focus on the negative. That was very much Richard's character. So then we get John. And everyone hates John. Historically. In his youth, he was nicknamed John Lackland. He was kind of like Henry I in that his father didn't give him any lands in his will. He was one of the sons of Henry II. He was the younger brother of Richard I. Richard I didn't leave any sons or heirs, and so John becomes king. And he had essentially been ruling the kingdom while Richard was away, and everyone was pissed because England kind of sucked. They had just come out of a very long civil war, and the population was starting to be educated. They started to realize what was wrong with society, what was wrong with their rulers, and it was easy to point fingers at John, especially when the hero king, the king that they wanted to believe in, who wasn't there, left John in charge. So in 1199, Richard dies, and John takes over as king. And there's still a massive disagreement with the church over laws. And now the Catholic Church is getting involved because the Catholic Church in Rome was the overlord of the church, obviously in England at the time. And John realized that the world was kind of against him. And John, being his father's son and his brother's brother, is also kind of an idiot as well. And so he's trying to figure out ways to get around the church. The church has been continuing to grow in power and influence, and now that Rome is connected, he's worried that England is going to be invaded. Now, France has a lot of backing by the Catholic Church, and he's worried that England is going to be invaded and his power is going to be abandoned. So what does John do? He doesn't try to make amends with the church. He doesn't try to give up some of his power to fulfill this position that the church has awarded him. He decides he's going to go to a land where the Catholic Church doesn't have any influence, and he hits up the Emir of Morocco. He reaches out to the Saracens in northern Africa and says, "Please help give me an army. I will do anything." And the Emir of Morocco writes back and says, "Don't be silly. Like, we have a huge army, but our cultures are so different. Like, you won't want our influence on your people. Like, even if we help you, there's going to be repercussions. Your people are going to be pissed." And John says, like, "I don't care. What'll it take? Like, please help." And the Emir, kind of joking, basically says, "Well, in order for things to work, all of your people would have to be Muslims." And John goes, "Okay, deal." John basically says that if you bring an army to protect England, I will force all of the people, including myself and my lords, to become Muslims in order to grant protection over ourselves. Now, that really would have flipped things on its head. If you can try to imagine England as essentially a new Spain, a successor to just kind of this caliphate state that Spain became. And the emir says that it's not going to work. Like, don't be an idiot, just deal with it. And that was the end of that. So John tries one more time to overpower the church in England, and this doesn't work. Now, at the same time that he's fighting with the church, the feudal lords are starting to realize that A, their king's an idiot, B, they also don't like being under the control of the church. So they decide to team up with John and overthrow the church as the reigning power in England. John is excommunicated by the Catholic Church. Most of the lords in England are excommunicated by the Catholic Church, and the church in England doesn't quite become reformed and doesn't quite become the Anglican church that we see today, but starts to be divided, starts to be very much separated from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, what happens next? The church loses its power, and John, who was on the side of the barons during this, comes to realize that the barons are still pissed that they don't have any power. And this sparks what is called the First Barons' War. This was basically the second official English Civil War. It took place over 2 years. Power between the king and his forces and the barons and lords in England. And eventually, the lords win, and they force John to sign what is called Magna Carta, which translates to essentially the Big Law, or the Great Charter is actually the direct translation. I like calling it the Big Law because it's more fun. This forces John and forces officially the King of England to establish limitations in his power. So when William the Conqueror had come over, he agreed to uphold the laws of England, but he was going to reform England in the Norman image. But he still agreed to certain limitations on his power because he knew that was the only way for the English people to support him long term. This had slowly dwindled away, with the kings of England slowly becoming more powerful and wanting more power for themselves and not wanting to be under any laws. And when this reached its peak with Magna Carta, finally there was a written description of what the powers of the king were to be. Now, England, and the United Kingdom more specifically, still doesn't have a written constitution. The Constitution of the United Kingdom is a traditional and verbal one. It's not like the Constitution of other countries. It's not like the Constitution of the United States, where you have a written constitution that is occasionally amended. The Constitution of the United Kingdom is essentially a word of trust that has been going on for over 1,000 years. What Magna Carta did is start to define what the rules of the law are, and the fact that they can't just change unless you rewrite a new charter. So that's where we get Magna Carta. John himself, like I said, he had a weird relationship with the church. He tried to sell the kingdom to Morocco. He had a weird relationship with his people. And actually, during this Barons' revolt, the barons tried to bring the King of France over to replace John. And so for a very short period of time, King Louis VIII of France became Louis I of England, and he too, very much like Matilda, had his coronation rescinded. So things weren't great when John was king. But like I said, his brother was an idiot, his father was an idiot, and it came to a head with John. I'm going to put John above his brother in D tier, but I'm still going to put him in D tier, because he was still an idiot and he still did a lot of damage to England. Now, we did get Magna Carta out of it, and that has kind of influenced society of democracies as a whole. A copy of Magna Carta still exists in the United States in the National Archives as kind of a precursor to our Constitution. But that's where I'm putting John. Now, he was succeeded by his son, Henry. Now, where do we put Henry III? Henry III became king at age 9. And so when he took over for his father, after his father had died, they weren't going to give power to a 9-year-old, even if that power was limited. And so they gave it to his regent, a man called William Marshall. Now, there were a number of Baron revolts and Baron rebellions during this time. William Marshall helped defeat them. That's kind of how he got the job. And eventually, they re-established the Magna Carta with the Great Charter of 1225, which kind of refined Magna Carta. It was kind of the first amendment to Magna Carta as a constitution. Henry III didn't really have a lot of power to begin with, and it continued throughout his life. So William Marshall is very much in charge during his youth, and then when he finally gets power, after William Marshall gives up this power to an adult Henry and eventually dies, Henry's left in charge. And Henry did not learn from the mistakes of his grandfather and namesake Henry II. He marries a woman called Eleanor of Provence, who was from Provence, which is in Provence in France, way down south. So at this point, basically the entire kingdom of France has been tied into English affairs. We had the relationship with Louis VIII, with John when he became king for a very short period of time. Now English history is very much tied to the entirety of France, especially with this marriage. As soon as she shows up, she starts putting her family in power, even worse than Henry II's wife did. She has, let's see if it shows it here. Edmund Rich became Archbishop of Canterbury. She had never been in England prior to the wedding. Basically, she came over and expected to be Queen of England, ruling as a French-style queen, and the people didn't like it. And Henry III, being his father's son and his uncle's nephew and his grandfather's grandson, doesn't realize what the people want. Even after he's led by William Marshall in his youth, he doesn't learn from the mistakes that have come before him. The 1200s were a rough time for the English people because their kings didn't understand anything about them or their society or what they wanted. There's a civil war with William Marshall's son Richard because Richard wants the power that his father had. This was fixed by the church. And then, as soon as Eleanor puts her family in power, now the people are pissed at Eleanor. They force her out of the country. They chase her out of the royal palace and send her back to France. Henry's left alone. He has very few allies. All of his wife's family that are in charge don't want to support him because he didn't defend his wife. And they're starting to understand Richard Marshall's opinions of the country and the way that he wants to rule, despite this being negotiated by the church. But while she's over in France, Eleanor falls in love with a guy named Simon de Montfort. Now, Simon de Montfort is an interesting character because he was an Englishman. He grew up in England, didn't really have any namesake to him. He was a very lowly lord, and as soon as she comes back into England and tries to get her husband back on her side, Simon is right next to her. Simon is right by her side. And Simon tries to fix all of the mistakes of Henry's kingdom, and Henry tries to let him. And this starts a variety of problems. It starts another civil war. Simon de Montfort seizes power. This is the Second Barons' War. This lasts for 3 years. Eventually, Henry III is reinstituted as king, but his entire reign is essentially circled around this idea that he never actually had power. All of these people in his life are using him to get their own power and then forcing him down. He was imprisoned on a number of times by a variety of different sides against him. He never really has any power for himself. and the country continues to suck. Like I said, the 1200s were a rough time for the English people. A lot of war, a lot of indecision on their king's side. I'm going to put Henry III in F tier. Now I'm going to put him above William II because William II, we don't really know anything that happened during his reign. Henry III sucked, but we still know a little bit about what was going on and why things happened the way they did. Now, eventually, during this Civil War, all of the people are tired of fighting, and Henry eventually dies. And that leaves Eleanor, his wife, and it leaves Simon de Montfort in charge of his powers, and the battle continues, the wars continue. But John's got a son, and his name is Edward I. And he realizes, all right, I'm in charge now. My father didn't have any power. My father was an idiot. I got to get rid of Simon. I got to get rid of my mom. And he meets at the climactic battle of Evesham in 1265, and he defeats Simon de Montfort, and he says, this is not happening again. He makes an example out of Simon de Montfort. They chop him up into little pieces and destroy him, and Edward says, here's the deal. This country has seen civil war long enough. We are done. England is a united people. We are done. I'm in charge. I will submit to the laws of the barons, but here's the deal. I'm doing what I want. You're doing what you want. We find peace with it. That's it. So, after that's over, Edward decides that he is going to, in unifying the English people, create what is essentially English nationalism. So over the past 200 years, there had still been a divide between the Anglo-Saxon people. There'd been a divide with the barons and the Normans and French influence. And finally, Edward says, I'm going to create a New England. Not literally New England, but what he does to start this is, supposedly, about a century before this, supposedly they found the bones of King Arthur. Now, King Arthur is not technically a historical figure. We don't have any clue when he actually reigned, if he reigned at all. But even back then, in the 1300s, he was a pseudo-historical figure, and everyone knew about him. He was kind of this, not even religious, but close to religious societal figure that existed in England at the time. It still does exist, of course. Supposedly, they found the bones of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. And so Edward and his wife carry the bones of Arthur and Guinevere to, I can't remember which church it actually was, but had them properly buried, and in this had himself officially crowned King of England in a very grand ceremony to give this idea that his kingship was not only blessed by God, but blessed by the past kings of England, blessed by the pseudo-historical figures of England. He was the new English hero. And he is kind of what we would describe nowadays as the very first English celebrity king. So after he figures out the Civil War, Edward creates this nationalist idea, and he starts to portray himself to the people as this higher-than-thou godly figure. And he starts trying to unite the people in a variety of ways. First of all, now that they don't have a civil war, all of these people who have lived their entire lives with war, they don't have any enemies. So in order to fix this and unite all of the English people behind a common cause, he decides he is going to kick the Jews out of the country. He is going to criticize the Italians, who would then take over the banks from the Jews. He is going to expand the English Empire and take back France because France had been putting their influence on England for so many years. Now he was going to invade France. He was going to invade Wales. He was going to invade Scotland and all of the British Isles, and all of the land surrounding England that had ever been associated with England was going to be part of this great English kingdom. It was a huge, huge deal. He was the first real populist king. So for that, I'm putting him in A tier. He's one of those kings you have probably heard of before. They call him Edward Longshanks. They also call him the Hammer of the Scots. If you've ever seen Braveheart, he is kind of the villain of the piece. Because in creating this English national identity, what he didn't anticipate is all of these minorities that he's suppressing, both within England and outside of England, they start to get this identity for themselves. Now, this is especially true in Scotland. With Wales, it's a little easier because the Welsh fight back immediately. There are two princes over there. One is called David, and one is called Llywelyn or Llewellyn. And I can't remember which was. I believe Llywelyn was killed in battle, and then they captured David and had him drawn, hanged, beheaded, and quartered. I believe in that order. I hope in that order. I mean, actually, that still sounds really terrible, but he makes an example of the Welsh, completely conquers Wales. Ever since Llywelyn was defeated in battle, the Prince of Wales is no longer an actual thing. It becomes a position ruled by the kings of England. Scotland's a little different. Scotland, it's a lot easier to hide, and they kind of give up a lot of territory to the English while they regroup. Edward conquers Glasgow, he conquers Edinburgh. They capture the Stone of Scone, which is the crowning stone. They bring it back to England, and Scotland is basically destroyed politically. But then you get figures like William Wallace, Braveheart. You get figures like Robert the Bruce. And eventually they fight back. But that comes after Edward I. He basically starts that. And he starts this series of wars with France. Previously, it had kind of just been with Normandy. It had been political skirmishes with France. Now it was all-out war in France. You've probably heard of him. That's why I think he's an A-tier king. He got a lot done for England. He unified the country for the very first time since the Norman conquest. He really gave the most to the greater amount of people that he could. Obviously, he had a lot of issues with minorities. Not issues with minorities, but he used minorities to the advantage of the populace, which puts him out of S tier for me because he used examples to make a more peaceful society for himself. Anyways, that's Edward the First. He is succeeded by his son, Edward II, who, in my opinion, is the worst king in the history of England. And I'm putting him very much at the bottom of F tier. Now, why do I think that? Well, first of all, let's talk about Edward II's backstory. His father, Edward, became king after Edward was already born. He grew up in the kingly palace. He grew up with all this grandeur and celebrity that his father brought to the throne. He essentially, through his adolescence and into his adulthood, became a celebrity prince. He never really fought in battle, and he never really expected to be king because Edward I actually had an eldest son called Alfonso. Now, having a king called Alfonso would be awesome for England. It did well for Spain, but Alfonso died. And eventually, Edward II becomes the clear heir to the throne. He was born in Wales at Caernarfon Castle, which eventually became the crowning place of the Prince of Wales. And growing up with this celebrity and with this expectation that he's not really going to be king, he develops kind of this head of grandeur and that there's not a lot of consequence in the world. He lives his life traveling around England and around France with a touring carnival. He, like I said, never really sees battle. This touring carnival, by the way, included a pet lion. So he traveled everywhere with this lion that he used as his pet. He had a circus that basically toured with him. And he had a very controversial relationship with Piers Gaveston. Piers Gaveston was this gentleman who, if you're familiar with Game of Thrones, imagine Edward II as Renly Baratheon and Piers Gaveston as Loras Tyrell. Piers was this very good fighter, a very burly knight, very good in tournaments, very good in battle, but he's also gay. And Edward really liked him. Now, he was already showing signs of being gay, or being, as his father would put it, less of a man or less of a king. And so his father actually brought in Piers Gaveston to teach him how to be a man. Because like I said, Piers Gaveston was this big athlete, this manly man, was very good in tournaments, was very good in battle. And as soon as they meet, they fall in love. And this was a huge problem, not only just for English society, but for the future of the English throne. As soon as Edward I, Edward's father, realizes what's going on, Piers Gaveston is sent away. They have nothing, don't want to ever see each other ever again. And as soon as Edward I dies and Edward II becomes king, Piers Gaveston comes back. When Edward II had a political marriage to Isabella of France, Piers Gaveston wore her jewelry to the wedding. When Edward II was crowned, Piers Gaveston showed up in royal purple, dressed like a king, showing off to the barons and being very feminine and very over the top, and using his relationship with Edward II to basically say, you can't do anything about this because I have the king on my side. Now, eventually, the barons would hunt Piers Gaveston down and kill him. That was kind of, 1300s weren't a great time to be gay, let's just say that. Now, it's not historically guaranteed that they were gay, but their relationship is very questionable, and nowadays that is traditionally what historians agree on. But after Piers Gaveston's death, Edward II has this relationship with his wife Isabella that is very up and down. Now, Isabella goes abroad to France. She doesn't want anything to do with her husband. She knows her husband doesn't want anything to do with her because of his sexuality. And while she's over in France, she meets a gentleman called Roger Mortimer. And if you've ever heard of Roger Mortimer or Isabella, it's probably from the phrase Isabella and Mortimer. Now, they have kind of been this, that term is used in place of a group of people who have their own best interests at heart. They're using their relationship to undercut the political establishment and the power in England. And as soon as Isabella has Mortimer on her side, they go back to England, get a bunch of the barons on their side, say, the king's gay, you hate that, let's overthrow him. And essentially they do. So they force Edward II to basically give up his throne. They capture him, they imprison him at Berkeley Castle, and they want him to give up the crown to Isabella and Edward's son, Edward III. Now, Edward III is old enough where he realizes that he doesn't want to be given the throne if his father doesn't want it as well. If his father doesn't give permission to be king, then Edward III doesn't want to be king. Edward II is never going to give up his crown, but he's imprisoned. So here's what they do. They force Edward to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward III, and then he is imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. They basically encourage him to die by doing a whole bunch of things. It's not quite Passion of the Christ levels of torture, but it's pretty close. And they basically cut his body and try to get him infected and do everything in their power to make him die without it appearing as an actual, like, serious assassination. Because they really don't want to portray that to Edward III. Isabella still wants the power that she holds over Edward III and alongside Roger Mortimer, that she doesn't want to become a villain to her own son. But eventually, Edward II just won't die. So, in the middle of the night, on some day in January in 1327, a bunch of guys rush into his bedroom, put a red-hot poker into the fireplace, and then kill him in the exact way you're thinking they kill him. He's dead. Edward III takes over. And now we get to Edward III. Edward III is where things really start to get interesting for the Kingdom of England and the King of England. And most of that has to do with what happens after his death. But let's talk about his reign first. I am going to put Edward III at the top of B tier. And now I will defend that decision. So Edward III takes over and immediately realizes that his mom's crazy and Roger Mortimer is a dick. So he overthrows Mortimer, yet another overthrowing of the establishment in favor of the king, and then overthrowing of the king in favor of the establishment, and vice versa. This goes on for hundreds of years in England. Edward III overthrows Mortimer and officially takes control as King of England. Now, his father had really screwed things up with society because his grandfather, Edward I, had created this war with France, had conquered Wales, had invaded Scotland, and under his father, Edward II, the wars in France and Scotland had started to fail because his father wasn't interested in fighting. This caused a lot of problems. First of all, the Scots were starting to now invade northern England. This became a problem for northern England. And then, as soon as France took back all of their territory, they closed off trade routes in the English Channel. This was a huge problem for the kingdom because if you're familiar with countries like England or Japan or countries that are islands and don't have a ton of land and supplies on that land to themselves, trade is crucial. So as soon as you cut off trade routes, especially the English Channel at this time, there were a lot of problems with the economy at the time. So Edward III takes over and he realizes he is going to have to finish what his grandfather started and what his father failed. So he starts the 100 Years' War, or what we now know as the 100 Years' War. He says he is going to invade France and we will not stop invading France until France cannot be invaded anymore. And he finishes his conquest of Scotland. He declares himself the rightful heir to the French throne in 1337. And things go pretty well for Edward III. Now, he reclaims the empire. He dissolves the militias, which essentially what he does is there are all these barons' revolts. And up to this point, in England specifically, it had kind of changed in Europe for the most part, especially in southern Europe. But England at the time, all of the fighters in the army, or everyone who was enlisted in the army, they were members of the feudal houses. So back to Game of Thrones, back to something like Lord of the Rings. All of these fighters are going to be knights that come from houses, and not specifically just from those houses, but they're almost always going to be people who are immediately loyal to the king. So when the king calls for war, all of his feudal lords have to answer his call and go off to war. What Edward III does then is he realizes what a disadvantage this is to both his conquest in having people who are not normally soldiers go off to war, and what it does to his country in having all of these soldiers go off and leave no one in their place to lead. So he creates a standing army. He basically employs knights, or more specifically, people who are not of noble birth specifically, to fight for him. So now when he calls his soldiers to war, these are well-trained, well-ready people who are not coming from noble families, who are not leaving their lands behind in order to go off to war. He basically employs people to fight for him. And so he dissolves the militias and creates an army loyal to himself that can no longer rebel against him because he is the one giving them money. It's no longer being fed from the ground up. Now it's being fed from the top down. This is very advantageous to him, and the wars go very well until something very, very bad happens called the Black Death. And starting in about 1348, 1349, the southern coast of England is met with the plague. And now, Edward III's power isn't necessarily seen as cursed, but the people are having a lot of problems, both economically, obviously physically, obviously with their livelihoods, and Edward doesn't know what to do. So he pauses his conquests for the most part and leaves things be, and Black Death ravages England to the point where the population is diminished by, oh gosh, I don't want to say, let me look something up real quick. Black Death in England. Final numbers. Contemporary accounts are often grossly inflated, stating numbers as high as 90%. Okay. 25 to 60%. If you average that out, especially in the cities, typically over 50% of the English population were dead from the Black Plague. So the population of England is basically sliced in half. So now you don't have people to feed each other. You don't have people to fight your wars. You don't have people to support what you have been doing. And things fall apart for Edward, and eventually he dies. Now, he lives quite a long time, actually. He was 64 when he died, which at the time was fairly long, especially when he was going to war as often as he was. He had a son called Edward as well, who would have been Edward IV, but he died before Edward III, so they call him Edward the Black Prince. Edward, however, had a son called Richard. And when Edward III dies, after 50 years of ruling, he is succeeded by yet another boy king called Richard II. Now let's go down to Richard II. I am going to put him, before I give you an explanation, in D tier. And I am going to put Richard II in D tier above Richard I. Now, he started off pretty hot. He started off under the kind of hand of his uncle, John of Gaunt. So this is where things get important, really important, when we start to talk about the Wars of the Roses. So King Edward III dies. And if we look at his genealogical table, here's what we have here. We have Edward III, the King of England. His eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, or Edward the Black Prince, is dead. John of Gaunt, who is technically the legal heir to the throne because Lionel of Antwerp is no longer eligible for the throne given his position. And actually, let me double check here. No, I lied to you. Lionel's no longer eligible because he's dead. The next in line to the throne is John of Gaunt. But the laws state that the eldest son of the eldest son is the heir to the throne. So Richard II takes over. Now, take a look at this. We have Richard II here, John of Gaunt here, the son of Edward III, and then we have the characters of Philippa of Clarence and Edmund of Langley. Now, they will come back. We're going to take a look at this in a few characters, but we're back to Richard II. Richard II becomes the boy king. He was born in 1367. He takes over in 1377, 10 years old. His uncle, John of Gaunt, is basically in charge of the country. So John is not king. He certainly could be king if he made a run for it, but he realizes how disadvantageous that would be and decides to rule from the throne of his nephew, Richard II. Now, England was running out of money. They needed money to continue the war. The populace had completely been sliced in half virtually. They didn't have any money for the war, and they didn't realize how few people were left in the country. So they're trying to promote the war and get money to support the war by taxing to the same amount that they had prior to the plague. Now, they realize they're not going to get the same amount of money if they tax at the same rate. So in order to get the same amount of money, they tax the people higher. And this really pisses off the people. This is something we would see with the American Revolution later on. So they are overtaxing the people, and the people revolt. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 is what this is called. The peasants are upset with John of Gaunt. He's not the king, but he's the one making these laws. We are going to revolt, and we are going to kill John of Gaunt. Now, they don't kill John of Gaunt, but they try to overthrow him and overthrow his government. And the Peasants' Revolt is led by a number of people, most importantly, Wat Tyler. Wat Tyler is this peasant who basically leads the Peasants' Revolt based on this poll tax. And finally, the two parties meet. They come together on the 15th of June at Smithfield. This is in 1381. And on the battle at Smithfield, Richard and Tyler are going to meet to discuss terms, and suddenly Tyler is shot and killed. And no one knows what to do. The rebels are pissed. They want Richard's side dead. They don't want to kill the king, but they want to completely obliterate his side because it's very obvious that someone on Richard's side killed the leader of the rebels. So what does Richard do? He actually does something very smart. He goes over to the rebels' side and he says, I will be your leader if you follow me into battle. And Richard goes on the rebels' side, abandons his troops, and basically wipes out his own troops, imprisons all of his leaders, and this is really the first time he makes a political decision on his own. It's a very smart one. So they get done with the battle at Smithfield, and Richard is now in charge, and he's gotten rid of all of his barons, essentially. John of Gaunt's still alive, but Richard is really in charge now. And then, as soon as the Peasants' Revolt is over, what does he do? He kills all the peasants. So he leads the peasants through their revolt, basically wins the revolt for the peasants, then he kills all the peasants and takes control of the throne again. He overthrows the barons and John of Gaunt then, and he is in complete control. Now, the peasants who are left, not the peasant leaders anymore, obviously, because he killed them all. The peasants who are left, still upset about this entire taxation issue, they have a new leader, and his name is Henry Gaunt, John of Gaunt's son. They get behind Henry Gaunt, and Henry Gaunt forces... Actually, his name wasn't Henry Gaunt. His name was Henry Bolingbroke. Henry Bolingbroke takes control of this group of rebels and says, let's overthrow Richard II. And they're like, yeah, obviously, let's do that. That's like, absolutely, let's do that. So he takes control and completely obliterates Richard II and his forces. Forces Richard to abdicate, and then eventually Richard dies. In fact, does he die almost immediately? Let me double check that. I just want to double check so I know I'm not giving you false information here. Death, 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 death. There were rumors that he was still alive after he was imprisoned, though it's very likely that almost as soon as he was deposed, he was killed by Henry's troops. Okay, so Henry takes over. Let's take another look at this chart. Genealogy. Here we have Edward III, right? John of Gaunt is born in 1340. Edmund of Langley is born in 1341. Philippa of Clarence is a woman. Lionel of Antwerp, who is the second son, does not have any male heirs. So, this makes Henry IV the very clear heir to the throne, or the true ruler, now that he has overthrown his cousin Richard. Now, where do I have Henry IV ranked? I have Henry IV ranked in C tier. And I am going to put him above Henry II here. Where are we at? Henry IV. Now, there's also a character over here called John Beaufort. And he was an illegitimate child of John of Gaunt, who was declared legitimate twice, especially during Richard's reign. So, almost immediately, Henry has a claim against him to the throne. And Henry is very anxious about this. Now, Henry's a very powerful man. He has a lot of people on his side. He takes over as King of England. But as soon as he takes power, now all of that anxiety that he put towards becoming the King of England starts to backfire on himself. He is super anxious that everyone is out to kill him. Henry, as soon as he took over, there were claims against him. There were people claiming to be the sons of Richard II, or sons who had better claims to the throne. But Henry was in charge, and he was nervous that everyone was now against him, and he was going to lose that right. And eventually he died. He basically became bulimic and ate himself to death and sickened himself to death and died of worry after about 13 and a half years on the throne. And nothing about his reign is super noteworthy, really. There were a couple Civil War battles during his reign, but a lot of it was fighting off possible more legitimate successors to the throne. I'm going to, like I said, put him in C tier. However, his son, Henry V, I am going to put way up in A tier. I'm going to put him just under William I. Henry V was really, really cool. In fact, Henry V is the subject of that Timothée Chalamet movie, The King, which was pretty good. And he looks dope in that movie. But anyways, Henry V comes to power. And he finally completes the conquest of France. This had been going on for 100 years. It had been paused because of the plague. It had been brought back after the plague. It caused the peasants' revolt. And finally, Henry V comes in and says, here's the deal. It's time. We're going to take over France. And he does. Basically, everything that Henry V wants to do and wants to accomplish, he gets done. Now, where does this kind of get on shaky ground? Well, as soon as he completes the French conquest, actually, before he, let's see here. Yeah, as soon as he conquers France, he marries a woman called Catherine de Valois. And Catherine de Valois used to be or rather was the daughter of Charles VI of France. So Henry comes over, conquers France, destroys the French king, deposes the Dauphin, who is the heir to the French throne, and marries the king's daughter. So, first of all, he basically does everything that the English kings before him were trying to do in making a grand spectacle of the English crown. He is the most legitimate king England has probably had in hundreds of years. He says he's going to do something. He does it. He makes his statement known. Deposes the king, deposes the heir, puts his own son as heir as soon as he marries the king's daughter and makes her have his heir. But then he dies very soon. He dies only 2 years later. And so he gets all of this done. And now the kingdom of France is under England's control for the first time ever. It's a dual kingdom. His son, Henry, who would become Henry VI, is heir to both England and France. And then all of a sudden, Henry V dies. Now, this leaves 2-year-old Henry VI, the rightful king, or the supposed king, of both England and France. This is a problem. The fact that he's 2 years old is a problem. The fact that France has just been conquered is a problem. So, where are we going to put Henry VI? We are going to put Henry VI at the bottom of D tier. Now, Henry VI was probably a great guy. There's an interesting case going on here with his grandfather. So keep in mind, Henry VI's mother was the daughter of Charles VI. Charles VI, the King of France, who was deposed in the battle with Henry V, had a lot of problems. He was severely mentally ill, seriously psychotic, possibly schizophrenic. There was a point that he had metal rods stitched into his clothes because he thought that he was made of glass, and if anybody touched him, he was going to fall over and break. Now keep this in mind. His daughter, who inherited his madness or potentially passed it on, became the Queen of England. Now, Charles VI is overthrown by Henry V. Henry V dies. Henry VI is now the 2-year-old king of both England and France. Now, this becomes a problem in both countries, not as much in England because his family is still very much in power in England. But as soon as his father dies, that claim to France that he has is on really shaky ground, especially given the fact that his uncle, who was previously the heir to the throne, wants the kingdom and is 19 years old, has an army at his back, and really wants his claim back. He almost immediately starts a new civil war in France and reclaims France and the French throne in favor of France. So Charles VII becomes king of France. Henry VI is stuck just being king in England. Now, England is still peaceful. Scotland was conquered. Wales was conquered. The trade across the English Channel didn't really have any problems anymore. England is a successful, thriving country. Henry VI is very focused on the church and very focused on learning. He is very disinterested in conflict, very much like Edward II. He decides that he is going to give his life to the learned peoples. He creates Eton. He creates a number of colleges in Cambridge. He expands learning in England, which is great. Society is doing very well. But then, almost immediately after he gets these things accomplished, he starts showing signs that he's insane. He starts having manic episodes. The people are fearful of their king because they don't know what he's going to do. He's not necessarily violent, but they're worried that he still has enough power that if he goes mad, anybody's life could be at risk. So eventually, a group of people who realize what's going on with him and his madness and who his grandfather was, they start to realize that they should probably take back the kingdom. And the person who is really behind this is a man called Richard, the Duke of York. Now, Richard, the Duke of York, is way over here on this side. So here we have Henry VI, right? He is a grandson of Henry IV, a great-grandson of John of Gaunt, a double great-grandson of Edward III. Now, there aren't any rightful successors to the throne through the line of John of Gaunt. None that are legitimate, at least. But through the third son, Edmund of Langley, the third living son, rather, who was the Duke of York, he has a son named Richard of Coinsburg. And through Richard of Coinsburg, who married, kind of ironically, Anne de Mortimer, who was the daughter of Roger Mortimer, they have Richard, the Duke of York. Now, Richard starts a rebellion. He says, here's the deal. I have a claim to the throne. I'm successful. I don't have any links to this madness with France. I would be a successful king. We've already deposed the king before. There was legitimacy issues in this line. We all knew that Henry IV was worried that he didn't have a legitimate claim to the throne. So what is the pain of overthrowing his descendants and putting someone without insanity on the throne? And the people are like, oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So the Duke of York starts a war with the Duke of Lancaster, who is the rightful king. This starts what is called the Wars of the Roses. Now, the reason they're called the Wars of the Roses is because the House of Lancaster used as a symbol a red rose. If they show it anywhere on here, they are definitely showing it right here. And the House of York used a white rose. And these are still symbols that are used in Lancashire and Yorkshire and were at the time. This is why they call it the Wars of the Roses, because it's two parties with those symbols fighting against each other. This war lasted 32 years. Now, during this war, a lot of things happened. First of all, Richard was very successful, except when it came to actually overthrowing Henry as king. He eventually died, leaving Henry still king, but the people still pissed and the country still at war. Richard had a son called Edward, who took up his father's army and eventually crowned himself without actually being in control of the country as Edward IV. Now, I'm going to put Edward IV. Where am I going to put Edward IV? I'll put him at the top of C tier. Edward IV comes in, and he is as focused on this issue as his father was. He is as ready to be King of England as his father was, and as soon as he kind of has the power to do so, he has himself crowned. And eventually, they do, in fact, overthrow Henry VI. Henry VI was not a battle commander. He had nothing to do with his forces. There were just people loyal to him because he was the king. Edward IV takes over, and here's where things get weird. So Edward IV, who is the rightful heir of the third son's line of Edward III, has a marriage with a woman named Elizabeth Woodville. Now, was this his first marriage? That's the problem. Because supposedly there was another woman who, prior to his marriage with Elizabeth Woodville, was married to him in an actual ceremony. Now, this was never proven to be true, but keep in mind, there is this story going around that Edward has been married twice, which makes all of his children with who would be his second wife potentially illegitimate. This becomes important later. Like I said, Wars of the Roses is very complicated, especially when it comes to the timelines, when it comes to the genealogy and the lineage of all of these people in the picture. But very important to remember that he had a potential first marriage, and all of his heirs were through what would then be his second marriage, which, according to the laws of the church and the laws of the Magna Carta and Constitution that were implemented in England, especially toward the royal family, that would make all of his heirs illegitimate. But at this point, this is unknown. So Edward IV takes over as King of England. And as soon as he takes over, he, not learning from predecessors, decides he is going to put all of his relatives in power. That hasn't gone well in the past for England. It still doesn't go over well in England. But Edward IV decides he's going to do it anyways. This is wildly unpopular with the people. Now, despite the fact that he has overthrown Henry VI and become official King of England, there is still a very large civil war going on, and Henry VI still has a very large number of people supporting him as king. So eventually, after Edward IV starts putting his own people on the throne, Henry's forces get enough people. I say Henry's forces, he wasn't in control of them, but his loyalists were. There were enough people loyal to Henry's claim and the claim of the former king that they put Henry back on the throne and force Edward off of the throne. So it bounces back and forth between these two, between October of 1470 and April of 1471. Now, eventually, Edward IV is finally able to accomplish his total conquest and kick Henry VI off the throne. But before Henry VI does this, or before Henry VI is kicked off of the throne, he meets with an interesting figure. Now, keep in mind, Henry VI, he didn't have any surviving children. He had a son called Edward of Westminster, but he was killed in 1471. So, as soon as Henry is deposed, he doesn't have any legitimate heirs, but his forces find what could be a potential missing link. Now, when we look at this very complicated family tree, and this one is actually very well streamlined here, we have down here Edward IV, and up here Henry VI. And what we're going to want to look at is this gentleman over here. Now, where does he come from? Henry VI, or rather, where are we at here? Do you remember a woman named Catherine of Valois? Now, she was the daughter of Charles VI. She was the one, through him, the madness came from. She was the one who was married to Henry V and the one who was Henry VI's mother. So, Henry VI's mom, after Henry V dies, goes off and falls in love with with a Welsh servant called Owen Tudor. Now, it's not quite clear if they were ever married, but given the fact that Henry VI was in fact dead, she was legally able to marry Owen Tudor. And they had a son called John. Now, I'm completely incorrect. Give me 1 sec here. They have a son called Edmund Tudor. Now, that shouldn't mean anything because Henry VI is still alive. At this point, he still has a son, and Owen Tudor is a nobody. and there's potential that they're not even married. But they have a son called Edmund Tudor. Now, as soon as Catherine dies, Owen Tudor finds himself in a unique position. He is the father-in-law of the King of England, and his son would then marry a woman called Margaret Beaufort. Now, Margaret Beaufort had a link to Edward III by way of her father, John Beaufort. And he was the illegitimate son that we talked about earlier of John of Gaunt, who at the time had been proclaimed to be illegitimate, but the records weren't exactly clear on if that marriage was legitimate or if the Parliament at the time had agreed to make them legitimate. So all of that to say that Henry VI now finds himself without an heir, and all of a sudden, his mother-in-law has a grandson called Henry, who is, by way of the female line, a direct descendant of John of Gaunt, which is the same line that Henry VI comes from. And all of a sudden, if all of the legitimacy issues are untrue, and this Henry boy is actually a legitimate child of John, or is a legitimate descendant and heir of John of Gaunt, then this boy becomes Henry's legal heir. And Henry VI still has a lot of supporters, but eventually he dies. So who do his supporters back? Henry VII. Now, Henry VII is a nobody. He comes from the Tudor family. The Tudor family is not noble. They come from Wales. They're not English. They have no roots in the actual government, in the English people, in the monarchy, except for the fact that his father is the son rather, of the former queen, and his mom is a descendant of the former king. That's all that his claim lies upon. But he still has support because people don't like Edward IV. But he was very attractive. So a lot of the people in the cities really liked Edward IV. But in the rural areas, they were still loyal to their former king. And as soon as their former king died, they rallied their support behind his legal successor, who was Henry Tudor. So the war continues, and Edward IV only reigns for 9 years. Or excuse me, he reigns for 12 more years after he retakes the throne. So he rules for 9. The wars are still going on. He gets replaced for a very brief amount of time by Henry VI. He retakes the throne, rules for 12 years. Henry VI dies. Henry Tudor is still fighting the war. So Edward IV dies, and all of a sudden, in pops his son, who is 13 years old. Less than 13 years old. He's 12 and a half. And his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, wants power. Now, his uncle, who would go on to become Richard III, who at this point is just Richard the Duke of York, thinks that his mother is going to completely overhaul the war, is going to completely destroy everything that his brother had accomplished with the War of the Roses. He doesn't agree with Elizabeth Woodville grabbing power for the family of the Woodvilles. And so Richard tries to protect Edward V by imprisoning him. Not necessarily imprisoning him, but keeping him safe inside the Tower of London, which at that time was the royal palace. However, here's what happens. Richard III realizes that the Woodvilles are all for themselves. And then Richard III learns about the fact that his brother potentially had an illegitimate, or rather a legitimate marriage to a woman before Elizabeth Woodville. So if that's true, then that means that Elizabeth Woodville isn't the rightful inheritor for her son, isn't the rightful regent to the kingdom, and her son is no longer legitimate. As soon as Richard III, or at this time Richard the Duke of York, realizes that this might be true, he makes it true. He finds the priest that did the marriage and forces him to make the first marriage legitimate. And at that moment, Edward V becomes illegitimate. Elizabeth Woodville has no claim to the throne, no claim to the regency. Richard III then becomes the rightful successor to his brother's crown. And this is when Edward V disappears. So Edward V and his brother, 12 years old, younger than 10, disappear completely. And that's when Richard III becomes the evil icon of English history that we know today. So like I said, the Wars of the Roses is very complicated. There's a lot of characters and a lot of different puzzle pieces going on. You basically have 3 parties fighting against each other at once. 4 if you include different succession lines. You have the 2 heirs of Edward III, the 2 different lines, John of Gaunt and Edmund of Langley, the Duke of York, being fought upon by the House of Lancaster, represented by Henry V, or the Sixth rather, and Edward IV, now succeeded by Richard III. Well, at the same time, Henry VI names a completely different successor to John of Gaunt as his heir. That is Henry VII, Henry Tudor. And then you get the Woodvilles and the Rivers families trying to inherit the throne on behalf of their grandson, Edward V, rather. So 4 different parties going on at once. And as soon as Richard III realizes that the Rivers might have no claim, he makes it so. So the Rivers no longer have any claim. The Rivers family and the Woodville family are all destroyed. Edward V disappears, presumably killed by Richard himself. Richard actually has a brother who potentially has a better claim than himself, called George Plantagenet, or the Duke of Clarence. He has him drown. And he's the last one left. He is the last one left on the side of the Yorks. He does not have an heir. And Henry VII has a lot of power and a lot of people behind him. And as soon as people start to realize what has happened with George, the Duke of Clarence, being drowned, and Edward V disappearing, and the Rivers and Woodville families disappearing, people start to turn against Richard III. And as soon as they turn against Richard III, all power lies in the hands of this illegitimate heir of John of Gaunt, Henry VII. And at the Battle of Bosworth, Henry VII finds the crown lying under a bush after Richard III is destroyed in battle, and he crowns himself the undisputed Universal WWE Champion of the world, King of England. So that's where we sit. Very complicated, very long. War of the Roses is a mess unless you really understand it. Like I said, 4 parties going on at once, but eventually one heir comes out of the ultimate showdown of ultimate destiny, Henry VII. And he is from the House of Tudor. Like I said, he is from this Welsh family that really had nothing going for it except for the fact that his grandfather was really attractive and the Queen thought he was hot, and the Queen may or may not have married him. So his grandmother, the former Queen of England, gives him all of his legitimacy, aside from the fact that his mom is a very, very distant, illegitimate descendant of John of Gaunt, who was a son of Edward III. Now, in order to solidify his claim, even though he's the last one left, he marries Elizabeth of York, who was the daughter of Edward IV. So he combines the houses of Lancaster and York, and finally England is done with civil war. England is united, the War of the Roses is over, the Lancaster king has married the York queen, everything is fine, House of Tudor time. So, now that we've cleaned all that up, I think I am going to put Edward V and Richard III on this chart. I'm going to put Edward V right above Edward II. He was a boy king who only reigned for a few months at most. I'll put him below William II because William II actually had a long reign, even though we don't know a lot that happened in it. And I'm going to put him above Edward II because Edward II was just a train wreck. But Edward V just kind of sits there. Richard III, he was evil, but everybody knows who he is. And his decisions played a massive part in unifying the country, whether he meant to or not. I'm actually going to put him at the top of D tier. Feel free to argue with me in the comments section below what you think. Now here's where we get to the Tudors, and as soon as we're done talking about the Tudors, that's where I'm going to split this video in half, and we will finish the rest tomorrow. But we have a few more kings and 2 queens to talk about before we conclude. So, Henry VII. Henry VII takes over, and he basically rewrites history. He makes himself legitimate by all the ways of the law. He makes the Yorks into this evil, wretched, not the Yorks necessarily, mostly Richard III. What he does that's really important is he dates his kingship from the day before the battle that he killed Richard III. He didn't kill Richard III necessarily directly, but before the Battle of Bosworth, which happened on the 22nd of August, he decides that he, in official documents, is going to date his reign from August 21st. And what this does is say, I never killed the king. This guy was just pretending to be the king. The people made me the king the day before the battle, and I just killed the imposter the day after. So he's officially the king. He starts to rewrite the War of the Roses to better favor the Tudors and the claim of the Tudors, and he makes the Tudors appear as the God-granted royal line. All legitimacy has been given to them. The people love them. He makes the culture feel like they love him more than they might actually do. Then, all of the potential heirs to other lines of the throne, like we said, there are so many loose ends here to this massive family tree. We talked about all of the children of John of Gaunt. We talked about the Beaufort family. We talked about the Rivers family. We talked about all of the other Yorks. The fact that him being a descendant of Catherine of Valois puts a really weird spin on his legitimacy. So in order to legitimize himself apart from the law, he has to destroy all of the imposter heirs. And he does this in a really, really interesting way. So, the King Edward V, who is the 12-year-old son of Edward IV, was supposedly killed by Richard III. Now, they never found the bodies. But what Henry VII has to deal with is there is a Yorkist loyalist party who basically dresses up a boy and makes him appear to be the rightful heir to the throne. If we're back talking about Game of Thrones, think of this as fake Aegon or young Griff from Dance of the Dragons. Basically, he probably isn't the actual heir to the throne, but they dress him up and make him believe that he is and make him speak on behalf as though he is the rightful heir. Henry VII has to deal with this. And what he does is, instead of just killing this imposter, which would give legitimacy to the fact that he killed a rightful heir, he can't just assassinate this kid. So he captures this kid and basically says, if you tell us the truth, if you tell us where you come from and what's going to happen, we'll let you be free. And so the kid, who hasn't been completely brainwashed into believing that he is the legitimate heir to the throne and the disappeared Edward V, says, yeah, all right, here's the deal. I think I grew up in France and these guys told me that I was this and they've been paying me off, blah, blah, blah. And so now Henry not only has this kid on his side, but he has exposed all of the people supporting the imposter behind him without having to actually kill a legitimate or potentially legitimate heir. He makes himself the hero by deposing all of the rumors. He does this a number of times. There was supposedly a legitimate heir to Henry VI that would have claim over him, and he did the exact same thing with that kid. One of them became basically a kitchen servant. One of them became a falconer. He saves these kids from being puppets of greater parties trying to take control of the crown, and in this makes his own claim stronger. Then he does something super controversial. He kills all of the barons, or deposes all of the barons. All of those who won't go willingly, he kills. All those who do go willingly, he takes away their power. And suddenly, England is a country without war, without need for feudal classes. The towns were huge. English society was starting to feel like we feel it in the modern day. And so in destroying these barons, now he has complete control over all of the populace. And the populace doesn't have to go through a third party to get to him. And this makes him very popular. He's basically freeing these people without giving them more wealth, without giving them more rights. He is basically freeing them in show and name only. And this makes him and his family wildly popular. I'm going to put Henry VII in A tier. He really made things very stable for his family, for the future of the English throne. And where am I going to put him? I'll put him bottom of A tier there. Then, of course, he is succeeded by not his first son, because his first son died, but his second son, Henry VIII. We are finally here, one of the greatest kings in English history. Now, most people think of Henry VIII in not a very kind way, and for a fairly good reason. He had 6 wives, and what's the order? What's the order of Henry VIII's wives' deaths? Because there's a rhyme to it, right? Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. So, he marries his brother's supposed to be king, right? King Arthur was supposed to be the successor to Henry VII. Henry VII did that on purpose. He wanted to so legitimize the Tudors that he made his son the new and actual King Arthur. Well, Arthur dies. And Arthur had a wife called Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was from Aragon, which is in Spain. So this wraps Spain into the English picture. She was the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, very Catholic. Henry himself was very Catholic. Now keep in mind, at this time, the Protestant Reformation was just starting in Germany. 1517, about 8 years into Henry VIII's reign, Martin Luther gives his 95 Theses. And Henry is a very smart guy, and he is pissed. So, in order to get the Catholics on his side and support him in his not only claim as the king, but in order to get political advantage toward potential conquests, at this time, we're starting to see movement into the New World. Obviously, this is after the discovery of the Americas. For political advantage, he marries the daughter of the king and queen of Spain, and he basically writes a deposition of Martin Luther, and he becomes very close friends with the Pope. For now. Now, at the start of his reign, Henry VIII is very, very popular. Try to think of Henry VIII as the star athlete that everyone loves. Super smart, Stanford grad, played in the NFL. I mean, this dude is huge. This is before he became like fat. This is the super athlete of super athletes, the Harvard scholar of all Harvard scholars, the heir to the throne. He is wildly popular. Everybody loves him. Everybody wants to love him. And he has just been married to the Princess of Spain. But his first wife doesn't give him surviving heirs. He has a son named Henry, who becomes Duke of Cornwall, who dies after 52 days. Then they have a daughter called Mary. She'll come up later. But he starts to realize, as things go on, at this point, he has been king for 24 years. And he still doesn't have an heir. Now, he is 41 years old and is starting to get up in age and realizes that if he is going to continue this legacy of the Tudors, he is going to have to do something about the fact that he doesn't have a male heir. So, what does he do? He decides to lobby with the Pope the fact that since his wife was formerly married to his brother, who is now dead, that marriage should never have been allowed in the first place. And so he tries to get the Pope to annul his marriage. This doesn't go very well. The Pope doesn't agree with him. They have a massive falling out. And finally, we get to Henry's big moment, what he's really known for. He decides that since he is such a learned man and since he knows so much about theology, and he sees what is happening in the rest of Europe with the Protestant Reformation, he is going to start his own Protestant Reformation. And that is when we come to the Anglican Reformation. He decides that he is going to completely separate the English church from the church in Rome. They're still going to be Catholic. They are the true Catholic Church now. But because he disagrees with the Catholic Church in Rome, he is going to become the Pope of England. He crowns himself defender of the faith. And over time, this would develop into what is now the Anglican Church, the Church of England. But at the time, the way that Henry pitched this to the people is they were still Catholic, but instead of being loyal to the Pope, the word of God traveled through him, which is still a technical belief in the belief system of the Church of England, that the law goes through from God through the king or queen of England. So, we get to the annulment of his marriage with Catherine of Aragon. And he decides he is going to marry the sexiest woman he can get his hands on, Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn is pretty much a commoner. She is the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, who was really a nobody until her marriage with the king. And she already had a relationship with Henry VIII because in his annulment to his wife, he had been sleeping with Anne Boleyn's sister. But eventually he decided that Anne was more attractive than her sister and decided to marry her. Now at this time, he is 42 years old and in desperate need of a son. So, he decides he is going to marry Anne Boleyn. And he does. And they have a child called Elizabeth. Now, you might notice that Elizabeth is also not a son. So, this happens. They continue to try for children, and none of them survive. But then it comes to his attention, after being married for about 3 years, that someone spotted Anne Boleyn potentially cheating on him. Now, Henry realizes that he has already annulled his first marriage. People aren't going to be behind him getting annulled again. Then it starts to look suspicious, which, ironically, would lead to 6 marriages. However, he knows that Anne Boleyn has struggled to produce heirs. He only has one surviving child with her, and it's a girl, and it's very likely not going to be a son. He is 46 years old at this point. 45 years old, excuse me. And as soon as he hears that Anne Boleyn is cheating on him, he gets a brilliant idea. He says, regardless if it's true or not, if I get rid of this wife, I have the right to marry again, and it doesn't look as suspicious. It doesn't make me seem like a failure in marriage. It doesn't make me seem like I am just rewriting laws to fit myself. Plus, if she does give birth to a boy and she's been cheating on me, then that child could become illegitimate. I have to save the future of this crown. So he puts her on trial for infidelity against the king. When she is found guilty, whether it be true or not, he makes it true. He has her beheaded. Then he marries Jane Seymour. Now, Jane Seymour realized the position that she was in. She had to walk a very fine line. She became queen very shortly after Anne Boleyn's execution. And as soon as she becomes the queen, they have a pregnancy and she gives birth to Edward VI. This is a boy, obviously. I would hope it's obvious given his name. But now Henry VIII has a son. And, good enough for him, Jane Seymour dies almost immediately. She dies postnatal complications less than 2 weeks after the birth of Edward VI. So, here's what Henry VIII is left with. He is now the complete ruler of England, the ruler of the church. Everyone is under his command. He has a wife that he is divorced from. He has a wife that is dead because of the law. He has a wife that is dead because of natural reasons. Legally, even without the theological disagreements, he has the right to get a new wife. He has the legal right to get a new wife because his last wife died, his previous wife died. Legally, within the church, regardless of the English Reformation, he is able to get a new wife. So 3 years later, he's 49 years old. He marries a woman from Cleves called Anne. And Cleves is, you might know it better as Dusseldorf in Germany. He marries this woman basically as a political maneuver. He finds her attractive from a distance or from everything he's heard about, but their marriage was mostly political. Because she was from Germany, he wanted to get in with the Lutherans and get in with the Protestants. He had already started this Reformation in England. It was taking off. He wanted to be combined with their political power. He had already thrown his alliance with the Spanish and the Catholics aside. He needed new allies. He was going to join the Germans. And then Anne of Cleves shows up in England, and he finds her unattractive, and he doesn't like her at all. They declare it unconsummated, and he believes legally, because it's unconsummated, plus the fact that he doesn't really care about the Catholic Church anymore, and he's starting to write his own rules about the church, and he's the supreme ruler of the church, he declares their marriage illegitimate and basically divorces her immediately. So then, he has 4 wives down, and he decides that he is going to marry Catherine Howard. Now, Catherine Howard was a babe. She was like the hottest thing in the town. He wanted everything to do with her. She was a tease, and he wanted it. He was very likely sleeping with her before they were married, but as soon as they were married, he got a hold of that and did not let go. Now, keep in mind, I mentioned that she was a tease, and he was very attracted to her, and so were a lot of other men in London and around the English capital. And she was okay with that because she started sleeping around with other men as well. And so Henry, now realizing that his fifth wife was doing potentially the exact same thing that his second wife did, had the exact same punishment given out to her. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, and now Henry is 54 years old. No, 52 years old rather. And finally, he's just going to find a woman that he finds attractive that's not going to sleep around on him, called Catherine Parr. And Catherine Parr is the most nervous person in the history of humanity, and basically has to walk the finest line possible until finally Henry VIII dies. Now, eventually, she would die as well. But she was not beheaded. She was not burnt at the stake. She was fine. She had complications from childbirth in her second marriage, but that left as soon as Henry VIII died at age 55, a son. Now, keep in mind, he has two other children still alive, but they're both women, so they have no rightful claims to the throne. So then we get to Edward VI. But I have to rank Henry VIII. Now, here's a controversial pick here. I think Henry VIII is an S-tier king. I think for what he did for English society, continuing on the rewriting of history and joyousness in the populace that he gave to the people, the Tudor period in England was one of the most peaceful and prosperous times in English history. There is a reason that the kings in the Tudor era and the Tudor dynasty as a whole is remembered, at least up to this point, very fondly. Now, he had 6 wives. Very controversially, 6 wives. If you try to put yourself in his headspace, you can slightly understand why things happened the way they did. You can understand why he had to divorce, or why he found loopholes into divorce Catherine of Aragon. You found reasons why he would poke holes in his marriage to Anne Boleyn, and as soon as he found out she was potentially cheating, why she would use that against her and kill her to legitimize his next marriage. Why, after that wife died, he would go for a new wife. Why, after finding her boring, he would try to annul that, having unconsummated it. Why he would then go for another woman, who then, as soon as she was cheating and legitimacy over his children would then be put into question, divorced and sliced off her head, and then married again. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I'm saying I can kind of understand it. Plus, he was really dope, and we all remember him. Henry VIII, everybody, S tier. That brings us to Edward VI. Now, Edward VI was 10 years old when he ascended to the throne. But, unlike previous child kings, he had a little more awareness and a little more power than those who had regencies before him. Most of his regency years were helped along by a man called John Dudley, who really held the power in England after the death of Henry VIII. Now keep Dudley in mind, but we're not going very far from him, but keep him in mind because we will come back to him. Now, Edward VI would rule for about 5 years. Actually, no, excuse me. He ascended to the throne at age 9, so about 6.5 years. Now, he had a lot of problems. First of all, he was very unhealthy. His mom died in childbirth, and she passed a lot of her ill health onto him. Died at 15 of natural causes. But being his father's child, as smart as his father was, and as smart as his grandfather was, he was very learned and very aware of the world around him, especially when it came to theology. He understood the English Reformation. He understood the Protestant Reformation. He understood what it meant to the people. He understood that because of the laws that his father had put into place and where society in England was moving, for Protestants at the time, the fact that he was ill, and he was aware that he was ill, he realized that he was not going to be able to produce an heir to succeed him at age 15. So that left two potential heirs to the throne. The legitimate heir would then be his elder sister, Mary. There were no male heirs left with the Tudors. All of them had been killed by his grandfather, Henry VII. So now the only legal successors to the throne, would be his sisters. And the older one was Mary I. Now, Mary was a Catholic. Mary was raised Catholic because her mom was Catholic. As soon as her parents were divorced, their marriage was annulled, Mary was raised in a Spanish Catholic household. So Edward realized that if he were to die without an heir, his sister Mary would come to the throne, as staunch Catholic as she was, and would basically burn the country to the ground because of the English Reformation. One person who really realized this and was probably whispering in Edward's ear about this was his counselor, John Dudley. So they decided, as soon as Edward realized he was probably going to die any day now, aged 15, John Dudley said, "Let's put my daughter-in-law in charge of the country, at least for a short period of time. That way Protestants can be safe, Protestants like me, and things are going to be fine for the Protestants." So as soon as Edward VI dies, who is legally left in charge according to Edward's will? Jane Grey. Now, this was the name that I said I don't want to rank on this list. And here's why. What did we talk about at the beginning of this video? Queens and kings in England are acclaimed. They are given their job because the people allow them to have that job. It's not just because the law says so. They are acclaimed. The only reason that today, in modern times, we have a monarchy in England is because the people continue to promote the monarchy. The people could, by law, vote to abolish the monarchy at any moment, but they don't. Or they haven't, as of me recording this video. Lady Jane Grey became the legal queen, but the people never voted for her. So, though she had a coronation, she never had any legitimacy with the people. She only ruled for 9 days. Because here's what happened. As soon as Edward VI died, his elder sister Mary came to England, and the people were all for her coming because she was the legitimate queen. They celebrated her arrival. Supposedly, she toured the minor towns before she got to London, and they acclaimed her everywhere she went. It was like, I like to think of it as an Olympic torch rally, right? You tour through all of these different towns through your country, and everyone cheers and follows, and it becomes a huge deal ahead of her getting to London. It was essentially the English royal retelling of Jesus appearing in Jerusalem, right? She was going to save them from the tyranny of John Dudley and Lady Jane Grey because they never voted for her. That Monty Python skit about not voting for a king, it's actually kind of legitimate when it comes to England. So, Jane Grey is there for 9 days. And finally, Mary arrives in England. And Jane is basically forced to give up the crown, and Mary takes over, and Mary is acclaimed queen, and all is good, and Mary, in order to secure her claim, has to kill Lady Jane Grey. So Mary kills Lady Jane Grey. So then we get to Mary. And where are we putting Mary the First of England? Oh, wrong Mary. We are putting Mary, at least in my opinion, I think we should put Mary near the top of C tier. I'll put her right under Edward IV. Like I said, she was acclaimed. The people loved her, especially the Catholics. The Catholics wanted her to come back because they felt like this English Reformation was wrong. They did not like the direction of the country. They wanted Catholic England back, and Mary was going to give it to him. Now, the Protestants didn't quite realize that, yeah, Mary was going to give it to him. As soon as Mary takes over, she flips on the Protestants. 280 Protestants are burned at the stake. She basically reclaims England for the Catholics. She was married to the King of France, Philip II. And all of a sudden, Spain has this massive political influence on England, and the people didn't realize what they had done. Now, not enough people are going to speak out against the Queen to rescind her queenship the way that they have in history, but Mary has a lot of power. And because she burns so many people and kills so many people, that's why they refer to her as Bloody Mary. But everybody remembers her, so I'm going to put her C tier. But still, she ruled for 5 years and pissed a lot of people off. The Catholics were happy because they weren't really in trouble anymore, but everybody else was. England was becoming a Catholic country, and this was not going well with the common folk. Now, eventually, Mary dies, and her heir is her younger sister and the only remaining legal heir to the Tudor throne, Elizabeth I. And this is the final queen that we will talk about, the final monarch that we will talk about in today's video. We will pick it up in tomorrow's video. But the final monarch of the House of Tudor is Elizabeth I. And Elizabeth I, in my opinion, is the greatest monarch in English history. Oh, I put the wrong Elizabeth there. Give me a second. Didn't mean to put the second there. Elizabeth I is going S tier. Why? When you think of the Queen of England, now, I shouldn't say that. When you think historically of the King and Queen of England, who do you think of? You probably think of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, maybe William the Conqueror, maybe Bloody Mary, Victoria probably, Elizabeth II, she ruled long enough. Elizabeth I created what is looked back upon historically as probably the greatest time in English history, save for maybe Victoria to challenge her on that. When Elizabeth I took over, England was coming off a very weird interruption of their happiness. Her father and her grandfather had ushered in an unprecedented age of peace and prosperity in England, and her sister had kind of screwed that up. Now, Elizabeth, in order to stay alive when her older sister was queen, basically had to profess that she had no religious affiliation and that she would never marry. Because as soon as she married, then there was potential that her sister's claim to the throne could be in jeopardy, especially if she were to marry a Protestant. So, when Elizabeth comes to the throne, she has already professed herself to never marry. She will never marry. She will never have children. She is the Virgin Queen. She has to walk a very thin line. So as soon as she gets in power, she has already seen what the Catholic rule of England did to the Protestant population. And she basically reverses that, but she doesn't want the same thing to then happen to the Catholic population. And she says, I will have no peace in this. I want to be the queen of all people, regardless of their political affiliation, of their ethnic origin. Here's where I want to stand as your queen. And so she walks this very thin line throughout her history, walking thin lines between her political advisors, between who she affiliates with socially. And at the same time that she's walking this very thin line, The architecture of England grows and the culture of England grows. Shakespeare takes over. He helps to rewrite the history of the Tudors to give them legitimacy. The same way that her grandfather had rewritten history in their favor, now Shakespeare was making the people believe it. Merry England was alive at the time. We look back at the late 1500s, the early 1600s in English history, and things were as prosperous as they probably have ever been, like I said, save for maybe the Victorian era. There was expansion into the Americas. We started getting a few colonies over on the eastern coast of the Americas, exploration into Canada, exploration into the rest of the world. The English Empire really started more during her father's reign, but really with Elizabeth I. That is when things start to really establish for the British Empire, the English Empire. There is not a lot of controversy during her years. There are a couple in terms of wars with France and Spain. There was a bit of a piracy and mutiny charge that went on during her reign, that she basically abandoned sailors at sea because they had abandoned their affiliation with the crown. And she really wanted nothing to do with Spain or the Catholics, despite the fact that she had to stay silent. So she had a motto, and it says it right here, and it was Video e taceo, or I see and I keep silent. Basically, her role as queen was to do what she was told and make the people happy. And never has that been not just the role of a king or queen, but has that been lived then in Elizabeth's era. So, I think she is the greatest monarch in English history. We'll talk a little bit more about the repercussions of her reign in tomorrow's video. But I have been rambling on for over 2 hours now. Somewhere around 2 hours, I hope. I haven't checked my timer in a while. But we're going to end things there. That is the first half of a 2-part video. Tomorrow we will pick it back up with the Stuarts, talking about James I all the way now to Charles III. We're not actually going to rank Charles III. I think that's unfair. But we will rank everybody through Elizabeth II in tomorrow's video. So links to that should be popping up on your screen again now as soon as that video does go live. More links to the channel and politics live streams will pop, or political videos in general will pop up around your screen as this video comes to a close. But like I said at the beginning of this video, this is the longest I've ever done in terms of content. So if you like it, if you learned something from it, if you want to talk about it, comment below. But really, please do like, share, and subscribe. It would really mean a lot to everything that I have done putting forth this video. So thank you very much. With that being said, we'll see you very, very soon.